it couldn't last. Soon we were being drawn to other worlds, where we discovered my brother Primarchs. We had been scattered throughout the galaxy not long after our birth, and, one by one, the Emperor recovered us all.
It must have been strange to be reunited with brothers you had never known.
Not as strange as you might think. As soon as I met each one, I had an immediate kinship with him, a bond that not even time or distance had broken. I won't deny that some were harder to like than others. If you ever meet Night Haunter, you'll understand what I mean. Moody bastard. But handy in a tight spot when you need some alien empire shitting in its britches before you attack. Angron's not much better, mind. He's got a temper on him like you've never seen. You think you know anger. I tell you now that you don't know anything until you've seen Angron lose his temper. And don't get me started on the Lion.
Of the Dark Angels? His is the First Legion, is it not?
It is, replied Horus. And doesn't he just love to remind everyone of that? I could see in his eyes that he thought he should have been War Master, because his legion was the first. Did you know he'd grown up living like an animal in the wilds? Little better than a feral savage. I ask you, is that the sort of man you want as your War Master? No, it is not, said Horus, answering his own question.
Then who would you have picked to be War Master, if not you? Asked Petronella. Horus appeared to be momentarily perturbed by her question, but said,
Sanguinius. It should have been him. He has the vision and strength to carry us to victory, and the wisdom to rule once that victory is won. For all his aloof coolness, he alone has the Emperor's soul in his blood. Each of us carries part of our father within us, whether it is his hunger for battle, his psychic talent, or his determination to succeed. Sanguinius holds it all. It should have been his.
And what part of the Emperor do you carry, sir?
Me. I carry his ambition to rule. While the conquest of the galaxy lay before us, that was enough. But now, we are nearing the end. There is a Cretan proverb that says that peace is always over there. But that is no longer true. It is within our grasp. The job is almost done. And what is left for a man of ambition when the work is over?
You are the Emperor's right hand, sir, protested Petronella. His favoured son.
No more, said Horus sadly. Petty functionaries and administrators have supplanted me. The War Council is no more, and I receive my orders from the Council of Terror now. Once, everything in the Imperium was geared for war and conquest. But now, we are burdened with exactors, scribes and scriveners who demand to know the cost of everything. The Imperium is changing, and I'm not sure I know how to change with it.
In what way is the Imperium changing?
Bureaucracy and officialdom are taking over, Miss Villar. Red tape, administrators and clerks are replacing the heroes of the age. And unless we change our ways and our direction, our greatness as an empire will soon be a footnote in the history books. Everything I have achieved will be a distant memory of former glory, lost in the mists of time like the civilizations of ancient Terra, remembered kindly for their noble past.
But surely the Crusade was but the first step towards creating a new Imperium for mankind to rule the galaxy. In such a galaxy we will need administrators, laws, and scribes.
And what of the warriors who conquered it for you? Snarled Horus. What becomes of us? Are we to become jailers and peacekeepers? We were bred for war, and we were bred to kill. That is what we were created for. But we have become so much more than that. I am more than that.
Progress is hard, my lord, and people must always adapt to changing times, said Petronella, uneasy at this change of temper in the War Master.
It is not strange to mistake change for progress, Miss Viva, said Horace. I was bred with wondrous powers encoded into my very flesh, but I did not dream myself into the man I am today. I hammered and forged myself upon the anvil of battle and conquest. All that I have achieved in the last 2 centuries will be given away to weak men and women who were not here to shed their blood with us in the dark places of the galaxy. Where is the justice in that? Lesser men will rule what I have conquered. But what will be my reward once the fighting is done?
Petronella glanced away at Apothecary Vadden, but he simply watched impassively as she took down Horace's words. She wondered briefly if he was as upset as she was at the War Master's anger. As shocked as she was, her ambitious core realized that she had the makings of the most sensational remembrance imaginable, one that would dispel forever the myth of the Crusade as a united band of brothers, forging their destiny among the stars. Horace's words painted a picture of mistrust and disunion that no one had ever dreamed of. Seeing her expression, Horace reached up with a shaking hand and touched her arm.
I am sorry, Miss Viva. My thoughts are not as clear as they ought to be.
No, she said. I think they're clearer than ever now.
I can tell I'm shocking you. I'm sorry if I have shattered your illusions.
I admit I am surprised by much of what you're saying, sir.
But you like it, yes? It's what you came here for.
She tried to deny it, but the sight of the dying Primarch gave her pause, and she nodded. Yes, she said. It's what I came here for. Will you tell me everything? He looked up and met her stare.
Yes,
he said.
I will. 11. Answers. A Devil's Bargain. Anathame. The Thunderhawk's armoured flanks were not as sleek as those of a Stormbird, but it was functional and would take them back to Davin's moon more swiftly than the bigger craft. Tech servitors and Mechanicum flight crews prepped it for launch, and Loken willed them to hurry. Each passing second brought the War Master closer to death, and he wasn't going to allow that to happen. Several hours had passed since they had brought the War Master aboard, but he hadn't cleaned his armor or weapons, preferring to go back the way he'd come out, though he had replenished his ammunition supply. The deck was still slick with the blood of those they had battered from their path, and only now, with time to reflect on what they had done, did Loken feel ashamed. He couldn't remember any of the faces, but he remembered the crack of skulls and the cries of pain. All the noble ideals of the Astartes. What did they mean when they could be so easily cast off? Kirill Sinderbin was right. Common decency and civil behavior were just a thin veneer over the animal core that lurked in the hearts of all men, even Astartes. If the mores of civilized behavior could so easily be forgotten, what else might be betrayed with impunity in difficult circumstances? Looking around the deck, Loken could sense a barely perceptible difference. Though hammers still beat, hatches still banged, and gurneys laden with ordnance curled through the deck spaces, there was a subdued atmosphere to the embarkation deck, as though the memory of what had happened still lingered on the air. The blast doors of the deck were shut tight, but Loken could still hear the muffled chants and songs of the crowds gathered outside. Hundreds of people maintained a candlelit vigil in the wide corridors surrounding the embarkation deck, and filled the observation bays. Perhaps 70 watched him from the windowed gantry above. They carried offerings and votive papers inscribed with pleas for the War Master's survival, random scribbles and outpourings of feelings. Quite who these entreaties were directed at was a mystery, but it seemed to give people a purpose, and Loken could appreciate the value of purpose in these dark hours. The men of Lucasta were already on board.
Though their journey to the embarkation deck had nearly sparked a stampede of terrified people, the memory of the last time the Astartes had marched through them still fresh and bloody. Torgadon and Vipus performed the last pre-launch checks on their men, and all that remained for him to do was to give the word. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to see the armoured figure of Tybalt Mar, captain of the 18th Company, approaching him, sometimes known as the Either, due to his uncanny resemblance to Verulam Moy, who had been known as the Or. He was cast so firmly in the image of the War Master that Loken's breath caught in his throat. He bowed as his fellow captain approached.
"Captain Loken,"
said Mar, returning the bow.
"Might I have a word?"
"Of course, Tybalt," he said.
"I'm sorry about Verulam. He was a brave man."
Mar nodded curtly, and Loken could only imagine the pain he must be going through. Loken had grieved for fallen brothers before, but Moy and Mar had been inseparable, enjoying a symbiotic relationship not unlike identical twins. As friends and brothers, they had fought best as a pair, but once again, Moy had been lucky enough to gain a place in the spear tip, and Mar had not. This time, Moy had paid for that luck with his life.
"Thank you, Captain Loken. I appreciate the sentiment," replied Mar. "Was there something you wanted, Tybalt?" "Are you returning to the moon?"
asked Mar, and Loken knew exactly why Mar was here. He nodded.
"We are. There may be something there that will help the War Master. If there is, we will find it. Is it in the place where Verulam died?" "Yes," said Loken. "I think so." "Could you use another sword arm? I want to see where it happened."
Loken saw the aching grief in Mar's eyes and said,
"Of course we could."
Mar nodded his thanks, and they marched up the assault ramp as the Thunderhawk's engines powered up with the shrieking of a banshee's wail. Aximan watched Abaddon punch the sparring servitor's shoulder, tearing off its sword limb before closing to deliver a series of rapid hammer blows to its torso. Flesh caved beneath the assault, bone and steel broke, and the construct collapsed in a splintered mess of meat and metal. It was the third servitor Abaddon had destroyed in the last 30 minutes. Ezekiel had always worked through his angst with his fists, and this time was no different. Violence and killing was what the first captain had been bred for, but it had become such a way of life to him that it was the only way he knew how to express his frustrations. Aximand himself had dismantled and reassembled his bolter 6 times, slowly and methodically laying each part on an oiled cloth before cleaning it meticulously. Where Abaddon unleashed his pain through violence, Aximand preferred to detach his mind through familiar routines. Powerless to do anything constructive to help the commander, they had both retreated to the things they knew best.
"The Master of Armories will have your head for destroying his servitors like that," said Aximand, looking up as Abaddon pummeled what was left of the servitor to destruction. Sweating and breathing hard, Abaddon stepped from the training cage, sweat lathering his body in gleaming sheets, and his silver-wrapped topknot slick with sweat. Even for an Astartes, he was huge, muscular and solid as stone. Torgadon often teased Abaddon, joking that he left leadership of the Gestarin to Folcus Kyber because he was too big to fit in a suit of Terminator armor. "It's what they're for," snapped Abaddon. "I'm not sure you're meant to be that hard on them."
Abaddon shrugged, lifted a towel from his arming chamber, and hung it around his shoulders.
"How can you be calm at a time like this?" "Trust me, I'm not calm, Ezekiel."
"You look calm."
"Just because I'm not smashing things with my fists doesn't mean I'm not choleric."
Abaddon picked up a piece of his armor and began polishing it before hurling it aside with an angry snarl.
"Center your humors, Ezekiel," advised Aximand. "It's not good to go too far out of balance. You might not come back."
"I know," sighed Abaddon, "but I'm all over the place. Choleric, melancholic, saturnine, all of them at the same time. I can't sit still for a second. What if he doesn't make it, little Horus? What if he dies?" The first captain stood and paced the arming chambers, wringing his hands, and Aximand could see the blood rising in his cheeks as his anger and frustration grew once more. "That's not fair," growled Abaddon. "It shouldn't be like this. The Emperor wouldn't let this happen. He shouldn't let this happen."
The Emperor hasn't been here for a long time, Ezekiel.
Does he even know what's happened? Does he even care anymore?
I don't know what to tell you, my friend,
said Aximand, picking up his bolter once more and pressing the catch that released the magazine, seeing that Abaddon had a new target for his impotent rage. It's not been the same since he left us after Ulanor, raged Abaddon. He left us to clean up what he couldn't be bothered to finish, and for what? Some damn project on Terra that's more important than us?
Careful, Ezekiel,
warned Aximand.
You're in dangerous territory.
It's true, though, isn't it? Don't tell me you don't feel the same. I know you do.
It's different now, yes,
conceded Aximand. We're out here fighting and dying to conquer the galaxy for him, and he won't even stand with us out on the frontier. Where is his honor? Where is his pride?
Ezekiel,
said Aximand, throwing down his bolter and rising to his feet.
Enough. If you were anyone else, I would strike you down for those words. The Emperor is our lord and master. We are sworn to obey him.
We are pledged to the commander. Don't you remember your Mournival oath?
I remember it well enough, Ezekiel, retorted Aximand. Better than you, it seems, for we also pledged to the Emperor above all Primarchs.
Abaddon turned away and gripped the wire mesh of the training cage, his muscles bulging and his head bowed. With a cry of animal rage, he tore the mesh panel from the cage and hurled it across the training halls, where it landed at the armored feet of Erebus, who stood silhouetted in the doorway.
Erebus,
said Aximand in surprise.
How long have you been standing there?
Long enough, little Horus. Long enough. Aximand felt a dagger of unease settle in his heart and said,
Ezekiel was just angry and upset. His humors are out of balance. Don't...
Erebus waved his hand to brush off Aximand's words, the dim light reflecting from the brushed steel plates of his armor. Fear not, my friend. You know how it is between us. We are all lodge members here. If anyone were to ask me what I heard here today, you know what I would tell them, don't you?
I can't say.
Exactly, smiled Erebus. But far from being reassured, Aximand suddenly felt beholden to the first chaplain of the word-bearers, as though his silence were some kind of bargaining chip. "Did you come for anything, Erebus?" demanded Abaddon, his collar still to the fore. "I did," nodded Erebus, holding out his palm to reveal his silver lodge medal. "The War Master's condition is deteriorating, and Targost has called a meeting."
"Now?"
asked Aximand.
"Why?"
Erebus shrugged. "I can't say." They gathered once more in the aft hold of the flagship, travelling the lonely service stairwells to the deep decks of the Vengeful Spirit. Tapers again lit the way, and Aximand found himself desperate to get this over with. The War Master was dying, and they were holding a meeting? "Who approaches?" asked a hooded figure from the darkness. "3 souls," Erebus replied. "What are your names?" the figure asked.
"Do we need to bother with this now?"
snapped Aximand.
"You know it's us," said Ire.
"What are your names?" repeated the figure. "I can't say," said Erebus. "Pass, friends." They entered the aft hold, Aximand shooting a venomous glance at the hooded Luke Sedere, who simply shrugged and followed them in. Candles lit the vast, scaffold-framed area as usual, but instead of the lively banter of warriors, a subdued, solemn atmosphere shrouded the hold. All the usual suspects were there: Sergar Targost, Luke Sedere, Kaelus Ekadon, Falcus Kyber, and many more officers and file troopers he knew or recognized. And Malakhurst the Twisted. Erebus led the way into the hold, moving to stand in the center of the group as Aximand nodded towards the War Master's equerry.
"It's been some time since I've seen you at a meeting," said Aximand.
"It has indeed," agreed Malakhurst. "I have neglected my duties as a lodge member, but there are matters before us that demand my attendance." "Brothers," said Targost, beginning the meeting, "we live in grim times." "Get to the point, Sergar," snarled Abaddon. "We don't have time for this." The Lodge Master glared at Abaddon, but saw the first captain's lurking temper and nodded rather than confront him. Instead, he gestured towards Erebus and addressed the lodge as a whole. Our brother of the 17th Legion would speak to us. Shall we hear him?
We shall, intoned the sons of Horus. Erebus bowed and said,
Brother Ezekiel is right. We do not have time to stand on ceremony, so I will be blunt. The War Master is dying, and the fate of the crusade stands on a knife edge. We alone have the power to save it.
What does that mean, Erebus?
Asked Aximand.
Erebus paced around the circumference of the circle as he spoke.
The apothecaries can do nothing for the War Master. For all their dedication, they cannot cure him of this sickness. All they can do is keep him alive. And they cannot do that for much longer. If we do not act now, it will be too late. What do you propose, Erebus? Asked Targost. The tribes on Davin, said Erebus. What of them? Asked the Lodge Master. They are a feral people, controlled by warrior castes. But then we all know this. Our own quiet order bears the hallmarks of their warrior lodges in its structure and practices. Each of their lodges venerates one of the autochthonic predators of their lands, and this is where our order differs. In my time on Davin, during its compliance, I studied the lodges and their ways in search of corruption or religious profanity. I found nothing of that, but in one lodge I found what I believe might be our only hope of saving the War Master. Despite himself, Aximand became caught up in Erebus's words. His oratory, worthy of the iterators, with the precise modulation of tone and timbre to entrance his audience. "Tell us!" shouted Luke Cedere. The lodge took up the cry until Sergar Targost was forced to restore order with a bellowed command. "We must take the War Master to the Temple of the Serpent Lodge on Davin," declared Erebus. "The priests there are skilled in the mystic arts of healing, and I believe they offer the best chance of saving the War Master."
"Mystic arts?" asked Aximand. "What does that mean? It sounds like sorcery."
"I do not believe it is," said Erebus, rounding on him. "But what if it was, Brother Horus? Would you refuse their aid? Would you allow the War Master to die just so we can feel pure? Is the War Master's life not worth a little risk?"
"Risk, yes, but this feels wrong."
"Wrong would not be doing all that we could to save the commander," said Targost.
"Even if it means tainting ourselves with impure magic."
"Don't get all high and mighty, Aximand," said Targost. "We do this for the Legion. There is no other choice."
"Then it is already decided?"
demanded Aximand, pushing past Erebus to stand in the center of the circle.
"If so, then why this charade of debate? Why bother even summoning us here?"
Malakhurst limped from Targost's side and shook his head. "We must all be in accord here, Brother Horus. You know how the Lodge operates. If you do not agree to this, then we will go no further, and the War Master will remain here, but he will die if we do nothing. You know that to be true."
"You cannot ask this of me,"
pleaded Aximand.
"I have to, my brother," said Malakhurst. "There is no other way."
Aximand felt the responsibility of the decision before him crushing him to the floor, as every eye in the chamber turned upon him. His eyes met Abaddon's, and he saw that Ezekiel was clearly in favor of doing whatever it took to save the War Master.
"What of Torgadon and Loken?"
asked Aximand, trying to buy some time to think.
"They are not here to speak." "Loken is not one of us,"
shouted Kalis Ekadon, captain of the Reaver squad.
"He had his chance to join us, but turned his back on our order. As for Tarek, he will follow our lead in this. There is no time to seek him out."
Aximand looked into the faces of the men around him, and he realized he had no choice. He never had from the moment he had walked into the room. Whatever it took, the War Master had to live. It was that simple. He knew there would be consequences. There always were in a devil's bargain like this. But any price was worth paying if it would save the commander. He was damned if he would be remembered as the warrior who stood by and let the War Master die.
"Very well,"
he said at last.
"Let the Lodge of the Serpent do what it can."
The difference in Davin's moon in the few hours since they had last set foot on it was incredible, thought Loken. The cloying mists and fogs had vanished, and the sky was lightening from a musky yellow to bleached white. The stench was still there, but it too was lessened, now just unpleasant rather than overpowering. Had the death of Temba broken some kind of power that held the moon locked in a perpetual cycle of decay? As the Thunderhawk had skimmed the marshes, Loken had seen that the diseased forests were gone, their trunks collapsed in on themselves, without the life-giving corruption holding them together. Without the obscuring mists, it was easy to find the glory of terror, though thankfully there was no deathly message coming over the Vox this time. They touched down, and Loken led Locasta's squad to Gadden, Vipers and Mar from the Thunderhawk with the confident strides of a natural leader. Though Torgadden and Mar had held their captaincies longer than Loken, both instinctively deferred to him on this mission.
"What do you expect to find here, Garvey?"
asked Torgadden, squinting up at the collapsed hulk of the ship. He hadn't bothered to find a new helmet, and his nose wrinkled at the stench of the place.
"I'm not sure," he answered. "Answers, maybe. Something to help the War Master."
Torgadden nodded.
"Sounds good to me. What about you, Mar? What are you looking for?"
Tybalt Mar didn't answer, racking the slide of his bolter and marching towards the crashed vessel. Loken caught up with him and grabbed his shoulder guard.
"Tybalt, am I going to have a problem with you here?" "No. I just want to see where Verulam died," said Mar. "It won't be real until I've seen the place. I know I saw him in the mortuary, but that wasn't a dead man. It was just like looking in a mirror. You understand?"
Loken didn't, but he nodded anyway.
"Very well. Take up position in the file."
They marched towards the dead ship, clambering up the broken ramps of debris to the gaping holes torn in its side.
"Damn, but it feels like a lifetime since we were fighting here," said Torgadden. "It was only 3 or 4 hours ago, Tarek,"
Loken pointed out.
"I know, but still."
Eventually they reached the top of the ramp and penetrated the darkness of the ship. The memory of the last time he had done this and what he had found at the end of the journey still fresh in Loken's mind.
"Stay alert. We don't know what else might be still alive in here."
"We should have bombed the wreck from orbit,"
muttered Torgadden.
"Quiet,"
hissed Loken.
"Didn't you hear what I said?"
Tarek raised his hands in apology, and they pressed on through the groaning wreck, along darkened hallways, flickering companionways and stinking, blackened corridors. Vipers and Loken led the way, with Torgadden and Mar guarding the rear. The shadow-haunted wreck had lost none of its power to disturb, though the disgusting organic growths that coated every surface with glistening wetness now seemed to be dying, drying up and cracking to powder.
"What's going on in here?"
asked Torgadden.
"This place was like the hydroponics bay a few hours ago. Now it's—"
"Dying," completed Vipers, "like those trees we saw earlier."
"More like dead,"
said Mar, peeling the husk of one of the growths from the wall.
"Don't touch anything," warned Loken. "Something in this ship had the power to harm the commander, and until we know what that was, we touch nothing."
Mar dropped the remains and wiped his hand on his leg as they journeyed deeper inside the ship. Loken's memory of their previous route was faultless, and they soon reached the central spine and the route to the bridge. Shafts of light speared in through holes in the hull, and dust motes floated in the air like a glittering wall. Loken led on, ducking beneath protruding bulkheads and sparking cables as they reached their ultimate destination. Loken could smell Yugen Temba long before they saw him, the reek of his putrefaction and death thick even beyond the bridge. They made their way cautiously onto the bridge, and Loken sent his warriors around the perimeter with directional chops of his hand. "What are we going to do about those men up there?" asked Vipers, pointing to the dead soldiers stitched to the banners hanging from the roof. "We can't just leave them like that."
"I know, but we can't do anything for them just now," said Loken. "When we destroy this hulk, they'll be at rest." "Is that him?" asked Mar, pointing at the bloated corpse. Loken nodded, raising his bolter and advancing on the body. A rippling motion undulated beneath the corpse's skin, and Temba's voluminous belly wobbled with internal motion. His flesh was stretched so tightly over his frame
that the outlines of fat maggots and larvae could be seen beneath his parchment skin.
"Throne, he's disgusting," said Mar. "And this thing killed Varulam." "I assume so," replied Loken. "The War Master didn't say exactly. But there's nothing else here, is there?"
Loken left Mar to his grief and turned to his warriors, saying,
"Spread out and look for something, anything, that might give us some clue as to what happened here."
"You don't have any idea what we're looking for?" asked Vipers.
"No, not really," admitted Loken. "A weapon, maybe."
"You know we're going to have to search that fat bastard, don't you?"
Torgadden pointed out.
"Who's the lucky sod who gets to do that?"
"I thought that might be something you'd enjoy, Tarek."
"Oh, no. I'm not putting so much as a finger near that thing."
"I'll do it,"
said Mar, dropping to his knees and peeling away the sodden remnants of Yugen Temba's clothing and flesh.
"See?"
said Torgadden, backing away.
"Tybalt wants to do it. I say let him."
"Very well. Be careful, Tybalt,"
said Loken before turning away from the disgusting sight of Mar pulling apart Temba's corpse. His men began searching the bridge, and Loken climbed the steps to the captain's throne, staring out over the crew pits, now filled with all manner of vile excrescences and filth. It baffled Loken how such a glorious ship and a man of supposedly fine character could come to such a despicable end. He circled the throne, pausing as his foot connected with something solid. He bent down and saw a polished wooden casket. Its surfaces were smooth and clean, and it was clearly out of place in this reeking tomb. Perhaps the length and thickness of a man's arm, the wood was rich brown with strange symbols carved along its length. The lid opened on golden hinges, and Loken released a delicate catch that held it shut. The casket was empty, padded with the red velvet insert, and as he stared at its emptiness, Loken realized how thoughtless he'd been in opening it. He ran his fingers along the length of the casket, tracing the outline of the symbols, seeing something familiar in their elegantly cursive forms. "Over here!" shouted one of Lucasta, and Loken quickly gathered up the casket and made his way towards the source of the call. While Tybalt Mar disassembled the traitor's rotten body, Astarte's warriors surrounded something that gleamed on the deck. Loken saw that it was Yugen Temba's severed arm, the fingers still wrapped around the hilt of a strange, glittering sword with a blade that looked like grey flint. "It's Temba's arm, right enough," said Vipers, reaching down to lift the sword.
"Don't touch it," said Loken. "If it laid the War Master low, I don't want to know what it could do to us."
Vipers recoiled from the sword as though it were a snake.
"What's that?"
asked Torgadden, pointing at the casket. Loken dropped to his haunches, laying the casket next to the sword, unsurprised when he saw that the sword would fit snugly inside.
"I think it once contained this sword."
"Looks pretty new," said Vipers. "And what's that on the side? Writing?" Loken didn't answer, reaching out to prise Temba's dead fingers from the sword hilt. Though he knew it was absurd, he grimaced with each finger he pried loose, expecting the hand to leap to life and attack him. Eventually, the sword was free, and Loken gingerly lifted the weapon.
"Careful,"
said Torgadden.
"Thanks, Tarek. And here was me about to throw it about."
"Sorry."
Loken slowly lowered the sword into the casket. The handle tingled, and he had felt a curious sensation as he had said Tarek's name, a sense of the monstrous harm the weapon could inflict. He snapped the lid shut, letting out a pent-up breath.
"How in the name of terror did someone like Temba get hold of a weapon like that?" asked Torgadden. "It didn't even look human-made."
"It's not,"
said Loken, as the familiarity of the symbols on the side of the casket fell horribly into place.
"It's Kinnebrak."
"Kinnebrak?"
asked Torgadden.
"But weren't they?"
"Yes."
said Loken, carefully lifting the casket from the deck.
"This is the anatheme that was stolen from the Hall of Devices on Zenobia."
The word went out across the vengeful spirit at the speed of thought, and weeping men and women lined their route. Hundreds filled each passageway as the Astartes bore the War Master on a bier of kite-shaped shields. Clad in his ceremonial armor of winter white with burnished gold trims and the glaring red eye, The War Master's hands were clasped across his golden sword, and a laurel wreath of silver sat upon his noble brow. Abaddon, Aximand, Luxidere, Surgar Targost, Falcus Kyber, and Caelus Echedon carried him. And behind the War Master came Hector Varvarus and Malaghurst. Each one wore shining armor, and their company cloaks billowed behind them as they walked. Heralds and criers announced the route of the cortege, and there was no repeat of the bloody scene on the embarkation deck, as the Astartes took this slow march with the beloved leader who had fought beside them since the earliest days of the crusade. They wept as they marched, each one painfully aware that this might be the War Master's last journey. In lieu of flowers, the people threw torn scraps of tear-stained paper, each with words of hope and love written on them. Shown that the War Master still lived, his people burned herbs, said to have healing properties, hanging them from smoking censers all along the route, and from somewhere a band played the Legion March. Candles burned with a sweet smell, and men and women, soldiers and civilians, tore at themselves in their grief. Army banners lined the route, each dipped out of respect for the War Master, and pleading chants followed the procession until at last they came to the embarkation deck. Its vast gateway was wreathed in parchment, every square centimetre of bulkhead covered with messages for the War Master and his sons. Aximand was awed by the outpouring of sorrow and love for the War Master, the scale of people's grief at his wounding beyond anything in his experience. To him, the War Master was a figure of magnificence, but first and foremost, he was a warrior, a leader of men, and one of the Emperor's chosen. To these mortals, he was so much more. To them, the War Master was a symbol of something noble and heroic, beyond anything they could ever aspire to, a symbol of the new galaxy they were forging from the ashes of the age of strife. Horus's very existence promised an end to the suffering and death that had plagued humanity for centuries. Old night was drawing to a close, and, thanks to heroes like the War Master, the first rays of a new dawn were breaking on the horizon. All that was under threat now, and Aximand knew he had made the right choice in allowing the others to take Horus to Davin. The Lodge of the Serpent would heal the War Master, and if that involved powers he might once have condemned, then so be it. The die was cast, and all he had left to cling to was his faith that the War Master would be restored to them. He smiled as he remembered something the War Master had said to him on the subject of faith. The War Master had typically delivered his words of wisdom at a wholly inappropriate time, right before they had leapt from the belly of a screaming stormbird into the green-skinned city on Ulanar. When you have come to the edge of all that you know and are about to drop off into the darkness of the unknown, faith is knowing that one of two things will happen, the War Master had told him. And what are they? He had asked. That there will be something solid to stand on, or you'll be taught to fly, laughed Horus as he jumped. The memory made the tears come all the harder as the huge iron gate of the embarkation deck rumbled closed behind them, and the Astartes marched towards the War Master's waiting stormbird. 12. Agitprop, Brothers in Suspicion, Serpent, and Moon. Slipping across the page like a snake, the nib of Ignace Carcass's pen moved as though it had a mind of its own. For all the conscious thought he was putting into the words, it might as well have. The muse was well and truly upon him, his stream of consciousness flowing into a river of blood as he retold the diabolical events on the embarkation deck. The meter played in his head like a symphony, every stanza of every canto slipping into place as if there could be no other possible arrangement of verse. Even in his heyday of ocean poems or reflections and odes, he had not felt this inspired. In fact, now that he looked back on them, he hated them for their frippery, their unconscionable navel-gazing and irrelevance to the galaxy at large. These words, these thoughts that now poured from him, this was what mattered, and he cursed that it had taken him this long to discover it. The truth was what mattered. Captain Loken had told him as much, but he hadn't heard him. Not really. The verses he'd written since Loken had begun his sponsorship of him were paltry things, unworthy of the man who had won the Ethiopic laureate. But that was changing now. After the bloodbath on the embarkation deck, he'd returned to his quarters, grabbed a bottle of Terran wine, and made his way to the observation deck. Finding it thronged with wailing lunatics, he'd repaired to the retreat, knowing that it would be empty. The words had poured out of him in a flood of righteous indignation, his metaphors bold and his lyric unflinching from the awful brutality he'd witnessed. He'd already used up 3 pages of The Bondsman, his fingers blotted with ink and his poet's soul on fire.
"Everything I've ever done before this was prologue,"
he whispered as he wrote. Carcassy paused in his work as he pondered the dilemma. The truth was useless if no one could hear it. The facilities set aside for the remembrancers included a presswork where they could submit their work for large-scale circulation. It was common knowledge that much of what passed through it was vetted and censored, and so few made use of it. Carcassy certainly couldn't, considering the content of his new poetry. A slow smile spread across his jowly features, and he reached into the pocket of his robes and pulled out a crumpled sheet of paper. One of Euphrate Keeler's Lectitio Divinitatis pamphlets, and spread it out flat on the table before him with the heel of his palm. The ink was smeared and the paper reeked of ammonia, clearly the work of a cheap mechanical bulk printer of some kind. If Euphrate could get the use of one, then so could he. Loken permitted Tybalt Mar to torch the body of Eugen Tember before they left the bridge. His fellow captain, streaked with gore and filth, played the burning breath of a flame unit over the monstrous corpse until nothing but ashen bone remained. It was small satisfaction for the death of a brother, not nearly enough, but it would have to do. Leaving behind the smouldering remains, they retraced their footsteps back through the glory of terror. The light was fading on Davin's moon by the time they reached the outside, the planet above a pale yellow orb hanging low in the dusky sky. Loken carried the anatheme in its gleaming wooden casket, and his warriors followed him from the wreck without any words spoken. A great rumbling vibration gripped the moon as a trio of towering columns of light and smoke climbed towards the heavens from the Imperial deployment zone, where this whole misadventure had started. Loken watched the incredible spectacle of the war machines of the Legio Mortis returning to their armored berths in orbit, and silently thanked their crews for their aid in the fight against the dead things. Soon, all that was visible of the Titan's carriers was a diffuse glow on the horizon, and only the lap of water and the low growling of the waiting Thunderhawk's engines disturbed the silence. The desolate mudflats were empty for kilometers around, and as Loken made his way down the slope of rubble, he felt like the loneliest man in the galaxy. Some kilometers away, he could see specks of blue light following the Titan carriers as army transports ferried the last remaining soldiers back to their bulk transporters.
"We'll soon be done here, eh?"
said Torgadden.
"I suppose,"
agreed Loken.
"The sooner the better."
"How do you suppose that thing got here?"
Loken didn't have to ask what his brother meant, and shook his head, unwilling to share his suspicions with Torgadden yet. As much as he loved him, Tarik had a big mouth, and Loken didn't want to put his quarry to flight.
"I don't know, Tarik,"
said Loken, as they reached the ground and made their way towards the Thunderhawk's lowered assault ramp.
"I don't think we'll ever know."
"Come on, Garvey. It's me," laughed Torgadden. "You're so straight up and down, and that makes you a really terrible liar. I know you've got some idea of what happened. So, come on, spill it."
"I can't, Tarik. I'm sorry,"
said Loken.
"Not yet, anyway. Trust me. I know what I'm doing."
"Do you really?"
"I'm not sure,"
admitted Loken.
"I think so. Throne. I wish the War Master were here to ask."
"Well, he's not," stated Torgadden. "So you're stuck with me."
Loken stepped onto the ramp, grateful to be off the marshy surface of the moon, and turned to face Torgadden.
"You're right. I should tell you. And I will. Soon. I just need to figure some things out first."
"Look, I'm not stupid, Garvey,"
said Torgadden, leaning in close so that none of the others could hear.
"I know the only way this thing could have got here is if someone in the expedition brought it. It had to have been here before we arrived." That means there was only one person who was with us on Zenobia and who could have got here before we did. You know who I'm talking about.
I know who you're talking about, agreed Loken, pulling Torgadden aside as the rest of the warriors embarked upon the Thunderhawk. What I can't figure out is why. Why go to all the trouble of stealing this thing and then bringing it here?
I'm going to break that son of a bitch in two if he had something to do with what's happened to the War Master, snarled Torgadden. The Legion will have his hide.
No, hissed Loken. Not yet. Not until we find out what this is all about, and if anyone else is involved. I just can't believe that someone would dare try and move against the War Master.
Is that what you think is happening? A coup? You think that one of the other Primarchs is making a play for the role of War Master?
I don't know. It all sounds too far-fetched. It sounds like something from one of Cinderman's books. Neither man said anything. The idea that one of the eternal brotherhood of Primarchs might be attempting to usurp Horus was incredible, outrageous, and unthinkable. Wasn't it? "Hey!" called Vipers from inside the Thunderhawk. "What are you two conspirators plotting?"
"Nothing," said Loken guiltily. "We were just talking."
"Well, finish up. We need to go. Now."
"Why? What is it?"
asked Loken as he climbed aboard. "The War Master," said Vipers. "They're taking him to Davin." The Thunderhawk was in the air moments later, lifting off in a spray of muddy water and a flare of blue-hot jet fire. The gunship circled the massive wreck, gaining altitude and speed as it turned towards the sky. The pilot firewalled the engines, and the gunship roared up into the darkness. The great red orb of the sun was dipping below the horizon, and hot, dry winds rising from the plains below made it a bumpy ride as they re-entered Darwin's atmosphere. The continental mass swelled through the armored glass of the cockpit, dusty and brown and dry. Loken sat up front in the cockpit with the pilots and watched the avionics panel as the red blip that represented the location of the War Master's Stormbird drew ever closer. Far below them he could see the glittering lights of the Imperial deployment zone where they had first made planetfall on Davin, a wide circle of arc lights, makeshift landing platforms, and defensive positions. The pilot brought them in at a steep angle, speed more important to Loken than any notion of safe flight, and they streaked past scores of other landing craft on their way to the surface. "Why so many?" wondered Loken, as their flight leveled out and they shot past the wide circle of light, seeing soldiers and servitors toiling to expedite the approach of so many landing craft. "No idea," said the pilot, "but there's hundreds of them coming down from the fleet. Looks like a lot of people want to see Davin." Loken didn't reply, but the sight of so many landing craft en route to Davin was yet another piece of the puzzle that he didn't understand. The Vox networks were jammed with insane chatter, weeping voices and groups claiming that the end was coming, while yet others gave thanks to the divine emperor that his chosen champion would soon rise from his deathbed. None of it made any sense. He tried to make contact with the Mournival, but no one was answering, and a terrible foreboding filled him when he couldn't even reach Malaghurst on the vengeful Spirit. Their flight soon carried them beyond the Imperial position, and Loken saw a ribbon of light stretching north from the landing zone. A host of pinpricks of light pierced the darkness, and Loken ordered the pilot to fly lower and reduce speed. A long column of vehicles, tanks, supply trucks, transporter flatbeds, and even some civilian traffic, drove along the dusty hardpan, each one swamped with people, and all heading to the mountain as fast as their engines could carry them. The Thunderhawk powered on through the fading light of day, soon losing sight of the column of vehicles that was heading in the same direction. "How long until we reach the War Master's position?" he asked. "At current speed, maybe 10 minutes or so," answered the pilot. Loken tried to collect his thoughts, but they had long since derailed in the midst of all this madness. Ever since leaving the Interrex, his mind had been a whirlpool, sucking in every random thought and spitting it out with barbs of suspicion. Could it be that he was still suffering the after-effects of what had happened to Jubal? Might the power, unlocked beneath the Whisperheads, be tainting him so that he jumped at shadows where none existed? He might have been able to believe that, but for the presence of the Anathame, and his certainty that First Chaplain Erebus had lied to him on the voyage to Davin. Carcassy had said that Erebus wanted Horus to come to Darwin's moon, and his undoubted complicity in the theft of the anatheme could lead to only one conclusion. Erebus had wanted Horus to be killed here. That didn't make any sense either. Why go to such convoluted lengths just to kill the War Master? Surely there had to be more to it than that. Facts were slowly accumulating, but none of them fit, and still he had no idea why any of this was happening, only that it was, and that it was by the artifice of human design. Whatever was going on, he would uncover the conspiracy and make those involved pay with their lives. "We're coming up on the War Master's Stormbird," called the pilot. Loken shook himself from his venomous reverie. He hadn't been aware of time passing, but immediately turned his attention to what lay beyond the armored glass of the cockpit. Tall mountain peaks surrounded them, jagged cliffs of red stone, veined with gleaming strata of gold and quartz. They followed the course of an ancient causeway along the valley, its flagstones split and cracked with the passing of the centuries. Statues of long-dead kings lined the processional way, and toppled columns littered this forgotten highway like fallen guardians. Shadows plumbed the depths of the valley along which they flew, and in a gap ahead he could see a reflected glow in the brazen sky. The pilot dropped their speed, and the gunship flew through the gap into a colossal crater, gouged from the landscape, like an enormous flat-bottomed basin. The sheer sides of the crater soared above them, its diameter thousands of meters across. A huge stone building stood at its center, carved from the same rock as the mountains and bathed in the light of 1,000 flaming torches. The Thunderhawk circled the structure, and Loken saw that it was a giant octagonal building, each corner shaped like the bastion of a fortress. 8 towers surrounded a wide dome at its center, and flames burned from their tops. Loken could see the War Master's Stormbird below them, a multitude of torchbearers surrounding it, hundreds, maybe even thousands of people. A clear path stretched from the Stormbird towards the Cyclopean archway that led into the building, and Loken saw the unmistakable form of the War Master being borne by the sons of Horus towards it.
"Take us down, now!" shouted Loken.
He rose, made his way back to the crew compartment, and snatched his bolter from the rack. "What's up?" asked Vipers. "Trouble?"
"Could be,"
said Loken, turning to address all the warriors aboard the gunship.
"Once we disembark, take your lead from me."
His warriors had efficiently prepped for a combat disembarkation, and Loken felt the motion of the Thunderhawk change as it slowed and came into land. The internal light changed from red to green, and the craft slammed hard into the ground. The assault ramp dropped, and Loken led the way out, marching confidently towards the building. Night had fallen, but the air was hot, and the sour fragrances of bitter blossoms filled the air with a beguiling, aromatic scent. He led his men onwards at a quick march. Many of the torch-bearers turned quizzically towards them, and Loken now saw that these were the indigenous inhabitants of Davin. The Davinites were more wiry than most mortal men, tall and hirsute with thin limbs, and elaborate top-knots worn in a style similar to Abaddon's. They wore long capes of shimmering patterned scales, banded armor of the same lacquered scales, and most were armed with crossbelts of daggers and primitive-looking black powder pistols. They parted before the advance of the Astartes, heads bowed in supplication, and it forcibly struck Loken just how close to deviancy these creatures appeared to be. He hadn't paid much attention to the Davinites the first time he'd landed. He was just a squad captain more concerned with obeying orders and completing the tasks assigned to him than paying attention to the locals. Even this time, his attention had been elsewhere, and the almost bestial appearance of the Davinites had more or less slipped past his notice. Surrounded by hundreds of the planet's inhabitants, their divergence from the human genome was unmistakable, and Loken wondered how they had avoided extermination 6 decades ago, especially since it had been the word-bearers who had made first contact with Davin, a legion not noted for its tolerance of anything beyond the norm. Loken was reminded of Abaddon's furious argument with the War Master over the question of the Interrex, and of how the first captain had demanded that they make war upon them for their tolerance of Xenos breeds. If anything, Davin was far more of a textbook case for war, but somehow that hadn't happened. The Davinites were clearly of human gene stock, But this offshoot of humanity had diverged into a species almost all of its own. The wide spacing of their features, the dark eyes without pupils, and the excessive, almost simian volume of thick hair on their faces and arms put Loken more in the mind of the stable-bred mutants some regiments of the Imperial Army employed. They were crude creatures, with the intelligence to swing a sword or fire a clumsy rifle, but not much else. Loken did not approve of the practice, and though the inhabitants of Darwin were clearly possessed of a greater level of intelligence than such beasts, their appearance did not reassure him as to what was going on. He put the Davinites from his mind as he approached a massive set of steps carved into the rock and lined with statues of coiling serpents and flaming braziers. 3 narrow channels filled with rushing water divided the stairs, one to either side and one down the center. The War Master and his bearers were out of sight on the next level, and Loken led his warriors up the processional stairs, taking them 3 at a time as he heard a monstrous grinding of stone up ahead. The image of vast monolithic doors appeared unbidden in his mind, and he said, "We have to hurry." Loken neared the top of the steps, the flickering coal braziers casting a ruddy glow over the statues that glinted from the serpent scales and quartz-chip eyes. The last rays of the dying sun caught the twisting snakes carved around the pillars, making them seem alive, as if slowly descending to the steps. The effect was unsettling, and Loken opened his suit link again, saying, "Abaddon, Aximand, can either of you hear me? Respond!" His earpiece hissed with static, but his hails received no answers, and he picked up the pace. He reached the top of the steps at last, and emerged onto a moonlit esplanade of yet more serpentine statues atop pillars that lined a narrowing roadway leading towards a giant arched gateway in the face of the massive edifice. Wide gates of carved and beaten bronze with a glistening, spiraled surface rumbled as they swung closed, and Loken felt his skin crawl at the sight of that dread portal, its yawning darkness rich with the promise of ancient, primal power. He could see a group of Astartes warriors standing before it, watching as the monstrous gate shut. Loken could see no sign of the War Master. "Pick up the pace! Battle march!" he ordered, and began the loping, ground-eating stride that the Astartes adopted when there was no vehicle support. Marching at this speed was sustainable over huge distances, and still allowed a warrior to fight at the end of it. Loken prayed that he wouldn't be required to fight at the end of this march. As he drew closer to the gates, he saw that, far from being etched with meaningless spirals, each was carved with all manner of images and scenes. Looping serpents twisted from one leaf to another. Others circled and swallowed their tails, and yet more were depicted intertwined as though mating. Only when the gate slammed shut with a thunderous boom of metal did he see the full image. Unlike the commander, Loken was no student of art. Nevertheless, he was awed by the full impact of the images worked onto the sealed gateway. Central to its imagery was a great tree with spreading branches, hanging with fruit of all description. Its 3 roots stretched out beyond the base of the gates and into a wide circular pool that fed the streams running the length of the esplanade, before cascading down the grand stairs. Twin snakes coiled around the tree, their heads entwined in the branches above, and Loken was struck by its similarity to the symbol borne upon the shoulder guards of the Legion Apothecaries. 7 warriors stood at the edge of the pool of water, before the massive gate. They were armored in the green of the sons of Horus, and Loken knew them all: Abaddon, Aximand, Targost, Sedire, Ekadon, Kyber, and Malakhurst. None wore their helmets, and as they turned, he could see that each one had the same air of helpless desperation. He had walked into hell with these warriors time and time again, and seeing his brothers with such expressions on their faces drained him of his anger, leaving him hollow and heartbroken. He slowed his march as he came face to face with Aximand. "What have you done?" he asked. "Oh, my brothers, what have you done?" "What needed to be done?" said Abaddon, when Aximand didn't answer. Loken ignored the first captain and said, "Little Horus, tell me what you've done." "It is as Ezekiel said. We did what had to be done," said Aximand. "The War Master was dying, and Vadden couldn't save him. So we brought him to the Delphos." "The Delphos?" asked Loken.
It is the name of this place, said Aximand. The Temple of the Serpent Lodge. Temple? Asked Torgadden. Horus, you brought the War Master to a fane? Are you mad? The commander would never have agreed to this.
Maybe not, replied Sirgar Targost, stepping forward to stand beside Abaddon. But by the end, he couldn't even speak. He spoke to that damn Remembrancer woman for hours on end before he lost consciousness. We had to place him in a stasis field to keep him alive long enough to bring him here.
Is Tarek right? Asked Loken. Is this a fane?
Fane, temple, Delphos, House of Healing, call it what you will, shrugged Targost. With the War Master on the threshold of death, neither religion nor its denial seems very significant any more. It is the only hope we have left. And what do we have to lose? If we do nothing, the War Master dies. At least this way he has a chance of life.
And at what price will we buy his life? Demanded Loken. By bringing him to a house of false gods? The Emperor tells us that civilization will only achieve perfection when the last stone of the last church falls upon the last priest. And this is where you bring the War Master. This goes against everything we have fought for these last 2 centuries. Don't you see that?
If the Emperor was here, he would do the same, said Targost, and Loken felt his collar rise to the surface at such hubris. He stepped threateningly close to Targost.
You think you know the Emperor's will, Sirgar? Does being Lodge Master of a secret society give you the power to know such a thing?
Of course not, sneered Targost. But I know he would want his son to live.
By entrusting his life to these savages?
It is from these savages that our own quiet order comes, pointed out Targost.
Yet another reason for me to distrust it, then,
snapped Loken, turning from the Lodge Master and addressing Vipers and Torgadden.
Come on, we're getting the War Master out of there.
You can't, said Malachhurst, limping forward to join Abaddon, and Loken had the distinct impression that his brothers were forming a barrier between him and the gateway.
What do you mean?
It is said that once the Delphos gate is shut, there is no way to open it save from the inside. A man in need of healing is carried inside and left to whatever the eternal spirits of deceased things decree for him. If it is his destiny to live, he may open the gate himself. If not, it opens in 9 days, and his remains are burned before being cast into the pool.
So you've just left the War Master inside? For all the good that will do him, you might just as well have left him on the Vengeful Spirit. And eternal spirits of deceased things. What does that even mean? This is insane. Can't you see that?
Standing by and watching him die would have been insane, said Malachhurst. You judge us for acting out of love. Can't you see that?
No, Mal, I can't, replied Loken sadly. How did you ever think to bring him here anyway? Was it some secret knowledge your damned lodge is privy to?
None of his brothers spoke, and as Loken searched their faces for answers, the truth of the matter was suddenly, horribly clear to him.
Erebus told you of this place, didn't he?
Yes, admitted Targost. He knows of these lodges of old, and has seen the power of their healing houses. If the War Master lives, you will be thankful he spoke of it.
Where is he? Demanded Loken. He will answer to me for this. He is not here, Garvey, said Aximand. This was for the sons of Horus to do. Then where is he now? Still on the Vengeful Spirit?
Aximand shrugged.
I suppose so. Why is it important to you? I believe you have all been deceived, my brothers, said Loken. Only the Emperor has the power to heal the War Master now. All else is falsehood and the domain of unclean corpse whisperers.
The Emperor is not here, said Targost bluntly. We take what aid we can. What of you, Tarek? Put in Abaddon. Will you turn from your Mournival brothers as Garviel does? Stand with us.
Garvey may be a starch-ass, Ezekiel, but he's right, and I can't stand with you on this one. I'm sorry, said Torgadden, as he and Loken turned away from the gate.
You forget your Mournival oath, cried Abaddon as they marched away. You swore to be true to the Mournival to the end of your lives. You will be oath-breakers. The words of the first captain hit Loken with the force of a bolt round, and he stopped in his tracks. Oathbreaker. The very idea was hideous. Aximand came after him, grabbing his arm and pointing towards the pool of water. The black water rippled with motion, and Loken could see the yellow crescent of Davin's moon wavering in its surface.
"See,"
said Aximand.
"the moon shines upon the water, Loken. The crescent mark of the new moon. It was branded upon your helmet when we swore our Mournival oath. It is a good omen, my brother."
"Omen," spat Loken, shrugging off his touch.
"Since when have we put our faith in omens, Horus? The Mournival oath was pantomime, but this is ritual. This is sorcery. I told you then that I would not bow to any fane or acknowledge any spirit. I told you that I owned only the empirical clarity of imperial truth, and I stand by those words." "Please, Garvey," begged Aximand. "We are doing the right thing."
Loken shook his head.
"I believe we will all rue the day you brought the War Master here."
Part 3. The House of False Gods. "13. Who are you?" Ritual. Old friend. Horus opened his eyes, smiling as he saw blue sky above him. Pink and orange-tinged clouds drifted slowly across his vision.